Khan University and Graduate School of Media and Communication in Kenya. Please, a round of applause for Aga. For Dr. Sam. We have Maha Bashri, who is a media gender policy analyst. She's a researcher, educator from the Global South minorities-focused United Arab University in Sudan. A round of applause, please. And last but not least, we have Cameron Evers, who's a senior analyst for Sub-Saharan Africa at Emergent Risk International in the US. A round of applause for Cameron, please. So, welcome, panelists. This will be a roving mic. We're going to start off by first we need to understand what is the geopolitical landscape in Africa, because a lot of what happens on the continent in terms of development, in terms of interactions, is heavily influenced by geopolitics. So I think we need to start there first. So I'm going to go ladies first and ask Baha, in your context, I'm sorry, in your context, what does the geopolitical landscape look like in your region?
Well, I think the first point that we need to address is that we always say Africa, Africa, Africa. Yes, it is a united Africa, but at the end of the day, it's different regions and different countries. We have 54 countries, and we all have different contexts. However, given the current geopolitical situation in the continent, things are bleeding from one area to the next, or from one region to the next. So there is an intersection of events, intersection of conflicts, intersection, obviously, of futures based on the outcomes of these conflicts. So I'll give an example, because tangibles always tend to be, very good in explaining what's going on. If we look, let's say, at the Nile River and what's going on with Ethiopia and their Renaissance Dam, which they would like to, or they actually built, this is causing a lot of strife in terms of water supplies for Egypt, for Sudan, for all the countries that run along that line. And in turn, this is causing a lot of political instability in the region, and economic instability and conflict. So one decision in one country has a ripple effect on other countries and other regions. And this is also affecting Kenya, it's affecting Uganda, so all the countries through which the Nile River runs. I'll give another tangible. What's happening now in the Sahel region, so we have Mali. Mali is very far away from Sudan, okay? We're not direct neighbors. However, there is a strong connection of the conflict in the western part of Sudan, in the Darfur region, and what is happening in Mali, because the conflict is moving both ways, from Darfur to Mali, to Mauritania, and vice versa. And you have the Wagner group in the middle and all of this. So what I'm trying to say here is that the geopolitics, even though we are 54 countries with different histories, different contexts, definitely intersections, but because we're so interconnected nowadays, they really bleed into one another. So we need to have, it's very important not only to understand the context right now, but to trace the historical foundations of what's going on, because history always tends to explain why we have current conflicts.
Thank you.
Yeah, I agree with Maha that it's really hard to do a general overview of Africa, considering the diversity and how each country has its own unique situation that takes a lot of individual studying, but I'm going to do my best to attempt an overview of Africa in terms of geopolitical trends that I think kind of affect the whole continent, at least in some way. The first of which is China, really massive, pretty much an economic miracle, the latter half of the 20th century with Chinese development, and how that's bled into Africa has been substantial, amazing in fact, where you had tens of millions of foreign direct investment, now it's billions per year. So there's this big push from China into Africa, and then you have the Western response to that a little bit, where there's a narrative that this is a predatory relationship, and of course there is a power imbalance there. But in some ways it's a symbiotic relationship that makes sense in a kind of a structural way. It's a good deal, right? If you do a counterfactual, like imagine if China didn't exist, what would Africa look like? Probably have less infrastructure. There'd probably be, who would fill that gap? So I think the Chinese aren't forcing Africans to sign contracts, rather they're providing a cheaper, faster method towards infrastructure, and they're being taken up on the offer. Sometimes they're the only offer, actually. Like if you have seen in the news with the pipeline that Uganda's trying to build, all the Westerners left that deal, and now it's being filled with Chinese. So sometimes they're the only ones. And so the U.S. and Europe and the West are pushing back against this in some ways. Like you have the Libido corridor that they're trying to develop. That's a couple $100 million investment from the U.S. That would connect Zambia to the Atlantic Ocean for critical minerals. You have the Europe Global Gateway project. That's like their version of the Chinese infrastructure. And again, a couple $100 million. The issue with these initiatives is that they really pale in comparison to what the Chinese are bringing to the table, just in terms of scale, right? And also, there's the issue of people have this kind of crisis fatigue and foreign policy prioritization that doesn't necessarily follow Africa closely because they get distracted. In terms of grand strategy, right? So what does the U.S. prioritize? It's control of the oceans and shores. Well, they're facing an existential crisis with this war in Ukraine, so they're distracted. They're not able to treat Africa as high on the list of priorities as they used to. And then one final trend here is Africa itself, right? What direction is Africa going? And I'm actually an optimist. I think that Africa's leverage power is much higher. I mean, look at Africa 30 years ago, look at it right during the independence era, and look at Africa today. Just amazing growth, economic development. Look at Ethiopia. In 2019, Ethiopia had 10% GDP per year. Only other country in the world at that time was Vietnam with that kind of growth. So we're looking at East Asia, tiger economies. That's in East Africa now at that level. So phenomenal stuff. Sadly, of course, that was derailed by the war. But I think Africa has a lot more bargaining power now, and a lot more choices. More businesses are coming in, and more countries are coming in, especially from the Middle East, like Saudi Arabia into Sudan, UAE into Sudan, but also Turkey everywhere. So there's a lot more choices about who Africans can do business with. So I think that makes it so that it's not just this China-dominated narrative, but China's going to lead the way because they're putting the most money in, but I think Africans have a much larger voice and role at the table now than they have before.
Thank you. Dr. Kamal?
Right. I can build on what he has said, because Africa also seems to be a theater for the different, great powers. And what we've seen is that China, the US, Russia, Japan, the Gulf states, Turkey, they all want a piece of Africa, and much of it is built partly around trade. But if you look at it, of course, Africa is attractive in terms of a favorable population. You spoke about the trade routes. You spoke about resources and the fact that the growth promise of Africa still remains very high. And because of that, it seems that, and you were talking about that in terms of what's the agency of Africa in this, because is it just a theater of competition? And yet these things affect Africa in one way. For example, the response to the Russia-Ukraine war and the effect on African economies, or you also talk about, for example, the issue of food, grain. And those are things that are important, that are in terms of what the great powers want and how that is affecting how Africa positions itself. But looking closer home, especially the western part. From the year 2020 up to now, we have seen some countries, actually 2 countries have had 2 successful coups, others perhaps happening once, Sudan. And this is important because in terms of how the regional bodies respond to this particular issue, it's important. Then the other one is the issue of violent extremism, again in the Sahel region and the Horn of Africa. This becomes an ongoing issue. For example, in the Horn of Africa, while there are some countries like Somalia and Kenya and Uganda that have witnessed repeated incidents, countries like Tanzania, who are yet to experience this, are still at risk. And then countries like Ethiopia dealing with this. So these realities become important and influence what also the other bodies, including foreign. To me, and to many observers, it sounded like some people wanted to have a conversation about climate change, and they decided to bring it to Nairobi. So Nairobi was just a venue, it was not necessarily an African conversation. Why? Because many of the issues and how they are perceived, and I cannot just highlight one. Food insecurity is a major driver of conflict. And also conflict is also a major driver of food insecurity. So when we look at the manifestation of climate change and how we are dealing with these issues, Africanizing that conversation so that it responds to the specific issues of Africa and what this means directly, then this becomes very important for us. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I think you've all touched on some very similar themes around the geopolitical landscape on the continent. And I like how you've sort of led us into our next talking point. There's so much you said. I wish we had more time because there's so much I'd like to unpack, but we're going to try and unpack as we go. We're going to build a plane as we fall off the cliff. And so I want to talk a bit about how information, with this context, the way information is shared internally as a continent, the information going out and the information coming in, because it's all heavily influenced by geopolitics, but also by tech, because now we factored in social media, right? The only reason we have, I guess, deeper context now of like different conflicts happening on the continent is people, sharing on social media, their stories. You're more in touch with what's actually going on, but then it's also been used as a tool to spread disinformation. And also, I liked how you talked about, I think it was Cameron, you talked about Africa has marketing power. Sam, you talked about how, the way, a theater really of competition, a theater, a platform in which everyone's interested, everyone is fascinated about Africa. So how do we manage that? What does it look like when we look at geopolitics and tech and how information goes in and out of the continent? Who'd like to take that first?
Okay, one of the positives of this technological revolution that we have is what I'd like to call communication sovereignty. When it comes to Africa, when we trace this from an academic research point of view, especially when it comes to news about Africa and the global north, the narrative is always very, very negative. What technology now is enabling us to do, and there's so many examples that attest to this, is that we own our own message. These platforms have enabled, especially young people, youth are very involved in creating spaces on these platforms where they share narratives as to how they see their reality. And again, because I am more akin to the situation in Sudan, I can tell you that our youth are very tech savvy, and the narrative, the political look at this from an economic point of view, it also changes the narrative, especially when it comes to markets, comes to leveraging our power. We have the resources, but we need to be smart now about how we leverage this power. And like Cameron said, we see a huge change in GDP. We see a huge change in economic forecasts for the continent, but there needs to be a vision. And I think that, as I said, the communication revolution is really going to be important in doing that.
Thank you.
So I have a more of a negative trend than a positive one, which is that the flow of information might not happen at all in some countries during certain times, and that's a geopolitical effect, at least inside countries where you're having information closed off. So this is a big problem, you know, that's kind of regardless of narrative, is whether people can get access to their information and their communications. And the trend that we're seeing here is it's moving up, right? So the world's becoming less stable. That's you know, whatever metric you want to use: wars, coups, unrest, protests, battle, fatalities. It's all going up according to the data. So you combine that with countries that are increasingly deciding to respond to this instability with just shutting off information. It's almost like a panic move, but it's the first response in a lot of countries. And that trend is actually increasing in two regions, Central Asia and Africa. So you have, I mean, I think one of the more infamous examples is Ethiopia, right? The Tigrayans haven't had access to internet for years. It's been kind of spotty lately, I believe. And then Amara region inside Ethiopia has also lost access to this, you know, so the federal government there with their $3 billion infrastructure built by China, digital infrastructure, is just turned off, you know, like a valve when they run into these conflicts. You also see it with elections. It's kind of become a default move for countries as a precaution to avoid some kind of incident, some unrest, or regime threat. You've seen that in a lot of countries. You know, you'll probably see it in the elections that are coming around the corner: Madagascar, Liberia, DRC, etc. Probably not in South Africa next year. They don't do this kind of thing, but it's definitely an issue with elections. And then, of course, it happens during military overthrows. This trend in Africa of rising coup d'etat. What's the first thing that goes, right? Well, the airport, the radio stations, well, the internet also goes, and sometimes it stays off for quite a while. So I think that issue of information not being allowed in the first place is definitely a geopolitical problem. And then you have disinformation, which there are disinformation experts here, so I won't, you know, go too far into this topic. But I think it's that narrative has been changed, especially with Russia recently. That's a big one. They've really become kind of the king of disinformation in the Sahel region, with shaping some narratives and going against kind of the Western dominant narrative, the Western prevailing narrative, and they use tactics, bots, social media, etc. And you see a similar trend where there's a spike in disinformation during these political crises, during conflict, and it's almost like they really want to appeal to your emotions, and they want to get kind of a rise out of people. They know they'll get the most eyeballs if they, you know, right when the Niger coup happens, you see 6,000 pro-Russia Telegram accounts, you know, rooting on the coup app, and this is against France, you know, so that's Russia's interest. So you see that in terms of the information environment, information flow, or these actors, foreign actors influencing the information. But yeah, that's all I have for that.
Thank you.
Then I can try and take maybe the middle ground, because internally, in terms of the conversations African countries are having about political issues, you can say there's greater agency even among the populations. We're able to talk about different things, people have opinion. Even regarding international issues, for example, the Russia-Ukraine conflict or Israel-Hamas, you will see a lot of conversations in ordinary WhatsApp groups, and people are talking about these things, they're expressing their opinions. And that's a good thing. But related to what he was raising is regarding the major geopolitical issues. Looks like the struggle for influence has gone online, targeting Africa. And here's the thing. In the UN General Assembly, Africa controls 28% of the vote. So it becomes important how African countries are likely to vote. So when there's a major issue internationally, somebody seeks to influence that conversation. For example, the conflict in DRC. You can tell there are other active players who are seeking to shape that particular conflict, and it's not necessarily the people of TRC. The same with even on the Israel-Hamas issue. Well, you can see, yes, Africans are having a conversation. Somebody else is seeking to also influence that because, like I said earlier, whether it's about trade, whether it's about security, whether it's about conflict, their interests, and the same seem to be manifesting. So on one side, I'm excited that citizens are engaging in these conversations, but on the other hand, I can tell somebody else or other external forces are influencing these conversations. Why? Because Africa has agency, and perhaps now looking at that, for example, now the 28% of the votes, and you have seen at times how countries like voting like on, even if it's a UN resolution, you see quite a number of African countries either abstaining from the vote, and you can tell it's because some of these influence campaigns have targeted the people. But lastly, I would also want to bring in what you'd call platform geopolitics, where the focus on misinformation and disinformation tends, of course, to focus more on the non-Western platforms, TikTok, and we're talking about TikTok disinformation. But at times, some of these things, these concerns are still present on these other Western platforms like Facebook and Twitter, X, and all that. So in terms of platform geopolitics, the question is, who exerts ideological influence on the conversations on the platforms? Because what we have seen is deliberate efforts to limit the conversations that do not necessarily go with the, align with the narrative that is aligned to the people who own the platforms. Therefore, you can see in relation especially to the Russia-Ukraine war, the available content, even for me as a researcher, when I'm looking for content and information that would help me understand these issues, I see what is available more online tends to align with one side of the narrative. And this becomes important in terms of now what you're saying, platform geopolitics.
Platform geopolitics. This is very interesting. I see a lot of nodding heads as all of you are speaking. So I think it's safe to say that every perspective shared is reflected in the countries represented here. Like everyone can pinpoint on something that you've said and say, I've seen that, or I relate to that, or I understand that. Gosh, I wish we had more time. Okay, all right. We're going to move on to the next question, but we're going to use what we've built so far. Okay, we're now getting to the engine of the plane so that we don't crash. So now that we've understood the geopolitical landscape, including the platform geopolitics, all right, now that we've understood the way information is moving and how it's also influenced by the platforms, like Telegram, by WhatsApp, by Western platforms, as well as foreign platforms like TikTok. And then we've also, looked at Africa's power and Africa's voice. All of you have touched on the youth and young people. Of course, is it 75% of Africa is under the age of 35? So, and just Nigeria alone, 70% of Nigeria's population is young people under the age of 35. So by the young people, right, below the age of 35. So with that in mind, let's touch on something that you've all sort of touched on, which is around just the development of the country, right, which is what makes it so attractive right now. And I want to touch on something that Cameron touched on around infrastructural development around the country and how you have players like China really driving a lot of the development in terms of infrastructure in a lot of African countries, with other countries as well included. But what we've understood about tech in Africa and development is that it's linear, right? It's non-linear, sorry. It's not a direct path. It's very non-linear because each country has very different needs and is at a very different level. You go to South Africa and there's certain things that are not a problem anymore, but you go, for example, just next door to Zimbabwe and there's some things that are still a problem, and you look at, it's pretty much the same across the continent. So that means development in terms of tech is non-linear. But now we're moving into this digital world. Right now we have a metaverse happening. People are watching this through the metaverse. People are live streaming, but not everybody's on the same page. So how do we even the playing field? I know you're not infrastructure specialists and all of that, but this is really just to pick your brain and pull out as much ideas and thinking so that we can guide the next generation. How do we even the playing field within ourselves as a continent, and also in comparison to the rest of the world? How do we catch up, or rather how do we find our own space? Sam, would you like to start? You look like you're like...
I'm actually excited about this question because I get a chance to share the Kenyan experience. And why this is important is in conversations with my friends from other countries, they've been talking about maybe Kenya has gotten this right, one way or the other. And I just want to highlight this document, you can find it online, the Kenyan Digital Economy Blueprint. And the mission is a nation where every citizen, enterprise, and organization has digital access and capability to participate and thrive in the digital economy. And what Kenya has done through a very well thought out and written strategy, the digital economy blueprint, is built around 5 pillars. So the vision is a digitally empowered citizenry living in a digitally enabled society. Initially that sounded aspirational, but as somebody who lives in Kenya and who is observing what is happening, it's built around 5 pillars. One is digital government. We're talking about the presence and use of digital services and platforms to enable public service delivery, but also ensuring they are accessible, affordable, secure, and convenient for the citizens. And I think I had somebody else talking about that in relation to another country. The second one is digital businesses, because of the immense opportunities that are available. So we talk about developing a robust marketplace for digital trade, digital financial services, and digital content, which is part of what Kenya has been doing in terms of financial inclusion around the use of mobile payments and all that. But number 3, which you have mentioned, is infrastructure, because we have to make this available to everybody. I believe government is a key enabler. Now in Kenya, for example, when you talk about infrastructure, we're talking about availability of affordable, accessible, resilient, and reliable infrastructure. So what is Kenya doing? Well, there is already a significant level of access for many people. They've developed what you'd call an integrated infrastructure master plan. What does it mean? In addition to the already connectivity that exists, Kenya has committed in the next couple of years to again add an additional 100,000 kilometers of fiber, and then 1,400 digital villages. And I think one of the speakers in the opening ceremony said Zambia is doing the same. So 1,400 digital villages. This is in every administrative unit, meant to spur innovation and, of course, additional or continuous infrastructure investment. The other one is what you'd call innovation-driven entrepreneurship, because I said government has a key role. So you're talking about creating an ecosystem that supports homegrown farms and initiatives to generate world-class products which will help widen this economic transformation. And then number 5, which is actually very important, but maybe this is one area we haven't made significant progress, is what you talk about digital skills and values. So in terms of digital skills, is you want to develop a digitally skilled workforce. And this is right from primary school all the way to tertiary institution. There was a time in 2013 when the president was being inaugurated, he said, we want every child joining standard 1 to get a tablet. And it sounded like a joke. But there have been investments in this direction to ensure everybody is skilled that way. And then, of course, now you talk about the ethics of operating in that kind of an environment. And of course, to be able to achieve that needs to be within the relevant policy and regulatory framework. But I think on this one, government would be a key player and a key driver in bringing about this access and trying to equalize the space and ensure everybody has access. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm sorry to rush you, speakers. We've run out of time.
Okay. Just quickly to piggyback on what Sam was saying. I do agree that cabinet or the government needs to play a role. But if we're talking from a practical standpoint, government is usually absent in Africa. Does not provide, there's no social contract. So again, just quickly, I'll go over the Sudanese experience. We have a huge disparity between male males and females and their access to technology and the internet. So it's like 55 to 47% when it comes to males versus females. It's grassroots, at the grassroots level. We have a lot of women's groups, actual like civil society groups, that have worked together to push cabinet, to force the government to actually invest in the infrastructure. But at the same time, they themselves have found ways and funders to provide, for example, cell phones, very basic cell phones with internet access to women in remote areas that don't usually have access to such types of technology. So just to wrap it up quickly, I'd like to say that yes, government is important if you have that social contract, but if it's missing, it needs to be from the ground up. Grassroots is really important when it comes to this.
Thank you.
I'll be fast. So I think it's important to level the playing field, to use countries like Kenya, Rwanda, others that have become tech hubs as a model for development of the tech space, and that means both the infrastructure, the connectivity, the telecoms, liberalizing these sectors, getting rid of the bureaucracy. They're all important. And then also with infrastructure development, just ease of business, right? To attract these Western tech companies, just make it easy to be there. I think, you know, there's a reason they all go to Nairobi, right? They know it's a good place to work. They know and it also has, you know, the amenities, right? It's a fun place to work. So there's these aspects. Some of them are less tangible, but they make it more conducive to tech development. And then in terms of real quick, in terms of making to level the playing field with the rest of the world, I think African countries should just keep going on the path of diversifying their economies. Get away from oil, get away from mining, or at least an over-focus on those issues, and more towards tech infrastructure development, which is easier said than done, of course, but I think diversification is the way to go. The Middle East has already started that way. I think it's a good way to go.
Fantastic. Ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to the end of our panel. Panelists, thank you so much for sharing your insight, your experience. It was invaluable, and I think this conversation is probably definitely going to happen over tea. It's going to keep going. So, ladies and gentlemen, a round of applause for our panelists. Panelists, thank you. Please make your way to your seats. Are we still okay? Everybody still okay? You sure? Sure? Okay, that's all right. I'd like to give a special shout out to our online community. We've had so much engagement. So ladies and gentlemen online, thank you so much for joining us today. And I'd like to give a special shout out to some people who are sharing their countries as well in the YouTube chat. So what's up Nigeria, hi Namibia, hi Sierra Leone, hi Johannesburg, hi Ethiopia. So welcome to the chat, and it's really good to have